Welcome to everybody. My name is Jen Chambers. I am the Assistant Vice President of Lifelong Learning at Duke Alumni Engagement and Development. I am ecstatic that we are starting off another Forever Learning Institute this fall. For those of you that are joining us for the first time in the Forever Learning Institute, this is an entirely virtual program where we bring the best and brightest of Duke faculty and senior administrators to the alumni audience for free educational programs. We started this back in the spring and had over 4,000 alumni from around the world that participated in one of the programs that we offered, and have 4 themes offered for this fall again. So if this is your first time joining us or haven't seen any of the other messages, we've got, this is the first session in the theme Solving the Unsolvable, which is really looking at wicked problems, those challenges that are hard to figure out one solution because they're incredibly complicated. But that's what we're focusing on today. We also have sessions on artificial intelligence and the ethics around artificial intelligence. We have one called The Art of Persuasion that looks at professional development topics within negotiating and persuading others to see your side of a conversation. And then the last one for this fall is actually an independent study, which is completely asynchronous, so you can do it whenever works for you. And that is called Enhancing Voices of the 19th Century. And there are tracks within that one as well on women's suffrage, armchair travel across the Eastern world, freedom, fear, and independence in Haiti, and medicine of the 19th century. So plenty of topics for you to dive into. And what the great thing about the Forever Learning Institute is you can participate in the entire theme or just one of the sessions that is of interest to you. All the sessions are recorded and all will be available also on our Forever Learning YouTube page, which we will share the link to at the end of today's session. So for today's session, I am delighted to welcome our 2 panelists. Moderator for today's conversation is Judy Seidenstein. She is the Chief Diversity Officer over at the School of Medicine and has been at Duke since 2011. She's also the first Chief Diversity Officer for the School of Medicine. So welcome to Judy. And then who is joining her today is Kimberly Hewitt, who is the Vice President at the Office of Institutional Equity. Kimberly has been here for a couple of years, starting with us at Duke in 2019. Prior to that, she was working at Johns Hopkins University and at the Hamline University School of Law. Before that, she did 14 years in practicing law in the areas of employment, labor, and education law. So with that, I will turn the session over to our 2 wonderful conversationalists today and invite people to add questions to the chat as they come to your mind. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen. Judy, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim. That's a great beginning. And thank you, Jen. We are both really excited to be here. And because Kim and I have a relationship and know each other and work together frequently, which is really a blessing from my perspective, we are going to shift it a little bit and not have me be a moderator and her be a panelist, but instead engage in a little bit of a dialogue back and forth, bounce the ball in this theme, which I love about, solving the unsolvable, wicked problems. And I definitely think that this speaks at this particular moment to the work that we're involved in, for sure, around addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, so I'm excited to be able to have this conversation with Judy. Judy was one of the first people when I came to Duke, who I got to sit down and have a meal with, and I felt like we just sort of automatically connected. So we really want to treat this like a conversation and then give you all a chance to ask us some questions. So Judy, why don't you share for us how you are addressing racial equity in the School of Medicine? Because I know there's a lot of really, complex and deep work that's happening in that space.
Yes, it has been, I've been doing this work at Duke for about 15 years and in the corporate arena for longer than that, probably another 15 years on top of that. And I would say that, like so many others who are engaged deeply in the work of equity, inclusion, diversity, and now really amplifying the criticality that I think for so long was sort of lurking underneath, that people wouldn't necessarily let embrace the full scope of anti-racism. So now anti-racism in the School of Medicine here at Duke, as well as so many other institutions, has come, front and center. We know now, and certainly as a society and as a nation, we've been grappling with the confluence of so many issues that have amplified the challenges and the barriers to race that have existed for so long in our nation. And our institution is a microcosm of our nation in many ways. And that can be good and that can be bad, right? But this past 18 months, specifically in the School of Medicine, we have really been focusing on taking a deep dive, broad, wide, into dismantling racism. What will it mean for us as a School of Medicine to truly be leaders in anti-racism and social justice, and advance equity, inclusion, and diversity? And so the way we have addressed this, Kim, is we went to our people, we went to our faculty, we went to our staff, we went to our learners, our students, both our MD students and our other health profession students, PA, PT. We went to our graduate students and our postdocs, and said, we have heard from you, because the truth is, they came to us first. We got some incredibly profound and powerful letters from our faculty, from our learners, especially, speaking to what this moment in time was really bringing forward for them. And it provided a channel on, wide open, to have conversations that frankly were long overdue in terms of racial reckoning. And so we embarked on, in June of 2020, we transformed, the dean transformed our usual state of the school, where we talk about all the things that we are focusing on, all our great accomplishments. And we transformed that to be phase 1 of our anti-racism strategic planning effort, and really looked at the state of the school as it related to racism, given the moment in time that we were in, both with the realities of the first global pandemic that we've navigated, and the disproportionate impact on Black and Brown community members, as well as the murder and ongoing anti-Black violence, the murder of George Floyd and so many others, and anti-Black violence. We really said, this is the moment to really say, are we doing this right? Are we going to go deep? Are we going to speak to people? Are we going to listen? Are we going to call the data and the voices and bring forward the stories and the perspectives, especially of our underrepresented in medicine faculty, students, and staff? And so we dove in, and it's been an 18-month process, deep dive, looking at courageous conversations. How do we deconstruct practices and processes that have been, quite frankly, ingrained in a white normed culture for a long time? Our APT process, right? How do we nurture, coach, and mentor? How do we do outreach and in-reach to our learners, to our faculty, to our staff? And so we've come up with these strategic priorities. We came up with a 52-page integrated strategic plan, which was the compressed plan from each of our constituent groups. So we had the faculty group, the student health professions group, the student graduate students and postdocs group, and then we had staff. Each one of those committees worked tirelessly with deep commitment and passion for the better part of 1.5 years, and produced a set of findings and recommendations that were meaningful. And then a small group of us really worked to integrate that into and compress it into a 52-page strategic plan. So we are just rolling that out now, and we're really about now shifting from the discovery and the exploration, or I should say the rediscovery, because there's not a whole lot that is new. It is just amplified, right? And now we're really moving into accountability and how do we implement. And a lot of that is happening in partnership, quite honestly, Kim, with you and others across the institution. So we're so thrilled to actually have people who, like yourself, have deep knowledge and experience in doing this work in ways that are strategic and that really will make a palpable difference. And so with that, Kim, I guess I'll shift over for you a little bit, and I'm happy to talk more about the School of Medicine if that makes sense, but I'd love to hear what, in your role as Vice President for the Office of Institutional Equity, huge role. I used to be in OIE before I went to the School of Medicine, and now I have a purview that's a little bit smaller, but still partnering with you and so many others across the institution. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing the university, and how are you working to advance racial equity from a systems perspective?
Sure. So a lot of what you described in the School of Medicine, I'm hoping that we're going to kind of create a similar structure around the whole enterprise. So my role really goes across all of Duke. And as we, go back to June of 2020, when President Price first launched these goals around anti-racism, we've sort of struggled to think about how do we look at this as a whole, and how do we have better coordination against, all of Duke, which is this huge, very decentralized and diverse community, in a way that makes sense, and then communicating that information to the university and to the health system community. So one of my big projects that I've been working on, with important partners in the School of Medicine and all across Duke, is this Racial Equity Advisory Council, which we had proposed to the senior leadership as a way to, again, create that structure and keep the momentum going. Because I think one of the challenges is that people don't know about all the work that is happening and don't have a perspective on whether or not Duke is really making progress. I mean, our goal is to transform the institution, but how do we know we're moving towards that goal? So this council is comprised of leaders from across Duke, and then attached to the council are 4 subcommittees. And these subcommittees are populated by students, staff, and faculty. So we have a subcommittee on climate and assessment, and that group will really it has already started engaging. We'll take the information and the data we gathered in the first, Duke University Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Survey, kind of unpack that data, identify where the gaps and opportunities lie, and create some tools so that local environments can take the information, attach them to the plans that they've already developed to help us, learn more about where we're going and be able to measure ourselves against where we are now and where we want to be. So, some of the results are what we anticipated, mostly maybe what we might anticipate. But, we still have so much information that we gathered, a ton of narrative or qualitative data that came from the community, which was really exciting. Then there's a committee that's looking at education curriculum. So how do we infuse racial equity in the curriculum? And then what are the training resources available for students, staff, and faculty? I think that's a big question mark. People want to know what's accessible to me, what's available, what do I need to make my team do? And so they'll be doing some auditing. I think we have a lot of overlap. So we want to think about best practices, how we can be a bit more efficient in that space. Then there's a committee on communications. And so that's going to really think about what are the best ways. We send these dense and lengthy emails to the university community, but is that the most effective way to really reach people and help them understand where the work is and where the gaps exist? And then the last subcommittee is really on infrastructure. Once we get all these recommendations and ideas together, do we have the infrastructure to support these plans? So, this is a new effort that we've started. We sort of started at the beginning of the summer. We have a group of co-chairs that met one time. We're really, we've hired somebody to kind of support it from an administrative and sort of data analysis perspective. So really excited about how that can support us. I think the other real challenge is how do we impact the lived experience of people really on the ground? I think sometimes even when we look at our data, we might feel like we've got we see in our leadership, we see some diversity, and we've seen some transformation around the faculty community, but there are some gaps definitely in terms of how we support the staff broadly, where we know those roles are inhabited largely. That's where large percentages of our Black and Brown community work and experience Duke. So we want to make sure that we have tools and metrics that will really demonstrate that, because I think for some people in their individual roles might say, well, you know, I see this information, but my individual experience is not transformed. So I think that's really a big challenge for us. And then, you know, again, the sense of overlap. So Judy, you know, we get together with other leadership in medicine and health system. There's just 5 of us. And every time we get together, there's something one of us doesn't know that the other is working on. So even in a small group of leaders like that, we understand our challenges around communication and coordination. And so I think that is a really huge challenge for us at Duke. And we're used to working in our silos. And there's value in understanding deeply your local community. But I think we want to get people more open to the idea of being a little bit more coordinated as well. So, you know, and I think when we're thinking about these really difficult challenges, part of the struggle is to have some patience. And I think people are impatient with this issue, but it's one that we are not going to solve in a year or 2 or 3. And so trying to really make some meaningful progress and identify what are the priorities that we can really achieve in this next year, and how do we really put that out to the community so they can see it. So that's a lot. We have many opportunities and many challenges in this space, but I'm excited about I think the interest and the energy, definitely from our leadership, to commit to this and to commit, you know, resources and people and all of that. And so again, going back to the Racial Equity Advisory Council, I really wanted a way to have every leader accountable. So it's not a group that's dedicated to people like Judy and I who have expertise and focus in this area. That council is all the deans and all the vice presidents, so that we have, you know, some real engagement with people who have, you know, responsibilities in their role. And if we're going to take seriously the idea that, you know, diversity and equity and inclusion is everybody's work and is integral to our ability to be excellent. So, Judy, I know we talked a little bit about what, you know, what kind of resources are we accessing as we do our work to help inspire us. And so if you could just talk a little bit about something you've read lately that had an impact or maybe sparked some creativity for you in your work.
Oh, it's so hard to pick one thing, Kim. Let's see. I will say, yeah, there's just, I'm sure like many in the audience who are interested in this topic, there is a plethora of information that I and so many others are consuming at this point. And I will say that, you know, I'm kind of a multimedia consumer of information. So I love podcasts, I love watching videos, and I love reading. A couple of things. One, some amazing podcasts that I've been listening to lately. One is called Work Life with Adam Grant. And I just recently discovered him, and it's not a diversity, equity, and inclusion show or podcast per se, but he's had some phenomenal guests on. He had a gentleman by the name of John Amici, who I worked with many years ago. And if anyone recognizes the name John Amici, he's a British Black gay NBA basketball, ex-NBA basketball star. And he really talks deeply about the concept of privilege and really helping us to understand privilege and make accessible the concept of privilege in a way that I think, especially for those of us who are white, can hear it and access it differently. And so one of the things he talks about that I think is so profound is looking at privilege more as an absence of an impediment in one's life, as opposed to something, you know, that I have earned, right? And so I've had lots of conversations after sharing this podcast with lots of folks, and I'll put it in the chat shortly so that people can see it, that, you know, it just provided this ability to wrap our heads and our hearts and our hands around this concept of privilege that many of us don't like to actually, you know, acknowledge or, you know, own in many ways. The other thing, and I have just started reading this, so many of you may know that at Duke we have a Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. We're one of 10 universities that have one of these centers, and that work is phenomenal. And I got turned on to a book by Heather McGhee, who is the daughter of the woman who founded this Racial Healing and Transformation Center at a national level. And Heather wrote a book called The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone, and How We Can Prosper. And she really talks a lot about, she's an economist, which I think is a really interesting angle on this. And she talked a lot about what we lose when we buy into the zero-sum game. And she introduces this great concept called the solidarity dividend, which really talks about the gains that come when people work together across race to accomplish certain things that we can't accomplish if we're just working alone. I happen to think that we have to do both, right? I'm a strong believer in thinking that communities of color and white communities need to do our own unique individual centering of this work, because I think there are conversations that happen in those communities that will be different than when we work together. And yet I also think it's critically important, and this concept of the solidarity dividend really lifts up the criticality of what happens, how can we solve some of these wicked problems, right, in community with one another while still honoring the importance of doing our work in unique communities as well. What about you, Kim? What have you been reading or listening to or watching?
Yeah. So, you know, over the last year and a half, you know, we probably read a lot of the same things. Ibram Kendi, Ijeoma Oluwa is one person who I really like reading her articles and, you know, her book. You want to talk about race? And then there's some amazing people at Duke. I mean, we've got some amazing scholars, race scholars at Duke. So Tavolia Glimpf, Eduardo Bonilla-Silver. But I got to be honest, when I really have a time to just sit down and read, I tend to choose fiction. And my kids accuse me of always choosing the same thing. You know, it's usually a story about a woman in some sort of struggle. But recently I read a book, and it really, I think one of our challenges in this space is that we get in our echo chamber. We live in a very polarized world. I think to some degree, Duke probably less so, but there's some polarization in our own community at Duke. And it's, you know, we're challenged to kind of cross those lines and engage. And that's one of the things that TRHT, that you mentioned, TRHT is really foundational. So I read this book recently by an author, Kristen Hanna. This book is called The Four Winds. And she has written another book that maybe many people have read called The Nightingale. But The Four Winds it's in Texas in 1934 during the Depression. It's about this woman and her family is a family of struggling farmers in the Great Plains. She leaves Texas to go to California in search of work. And this is a white family who gets to California and are completely marginalized because they're from the Dust Bowl. And I just found it fascinating. It was not a community or a story that I knew much about. They just really made me think about American culture and how baked into it is the idea of othering and then excluding the others. So, I mean, they couldn't, and people probably know more about this than I do, but her family couldn't find a place to live. They couldn't get jobs. They were treated horribly. So it was just interesting. It was just kind of an impactful story to me and a reminder to kind of think about where there is intersection, where it feels like we can't possibly have similar experiences or identify ways to engage. So if I think about an area where I'm challenged, it is kind of finding ways to reach across and talk to people who have really different point of view, especially about the work that we do. And I think my instinct is to just not engage. And so this book was kind of a reminder about the importance of doing that and to think about ways that we can kind of break through some of these differences and think about where we're similarities. So fascinating book. It was super quick read and just a really interesting story about a lived experience that's completely divorced from my own. So I would have no connection to people who experience that kind of life. So I just put that out there for folks to think about. Kind of in that same spirit, I think that one of our sort of opportunities is to try to make sure we have shared understanding about some of the language that we use, right? What is diversity? What is equity? What is anti-racism? What is racial equity? And one kind of distinction I think that people often get maybe mixed together is the notion of equity versus equality. And so I don't know, Judy, if you have just general thoughts about how we establish some shared language and the importance of that you could discuss.
Yeah, yes, Kim. And it's interesting because I think we can never spend too much time in ensuring that to a certain extent, we're all speaking the same language, right? That we're on the same page, because clearly we have a variety of perspectives and frames that inform our language around certain things. And we often think we're talking about the same thing, and it's not always the same. And I apologize. I don't know if you can hear in the background, but of course, some landscaper is blowing out. See, this is the joys of virtual living here. So I hope you can hear me okay. Can you hear me, Kim? Okay, great.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, when let me try and tease apart a little bit these concepts of equity and equality, because I think that oftentimes if you can get the distinction between these two terms, you can really make great leaps of progress, of advancing the mission, so to speak. So what I will say is, I think oftentimes people think that it's very mundane, the difference between equity and equality. Well, very, very similar. People often, when I say what is equity, they often define it in terms of equality and vice versa, right? So if I say what is equity, people often say, well, it's about treating everybody the same. Not exactly, because when we treat everyone exactly the same or equally, that mentality, right, that's really about ignoring the differences and having one rule book, one way that we treat everyone, which in order to do that, we're actually invisibilizing, right? We're taking away the unique nature of an individual based upon their race or their ethnicity or their sexual orientation or their gender identity, etc. Right? I'm going to treat everyone the same. And I would say, many people were raised, right, in their family of origin where the golden rule, treat everyone as you want to be treated, was one of the things to aspire to. But what we know in the field of DEI now is that that doesn't actually work in terms of leveraging innovation, creativity, and a sense of belonging in the work environment and the learning environment. Instead, the shift is really about acknowledging the differences, right? So I want to acknowledge the fact, Kim, that you are a woman of color, not ignore that, like acknowledge that in fact, because of that, that informs your brilliance, your perspective, what you bring to the table, right? So it's really that distinction that I think is so critically important. To this day, I still often hear when I'm leading workshops, which I don't get to do as frequently as I'd like to, but when I do, I mean, literally 2 weeks ago, I still hear people talking about this aspiration of becoming color blind or gender blind, because that is something that has been perpetuated, passed down to them by authority figures, by their family as a goal. And it's often an awkward but important, uncomfortable conversation to invite people to actually see that while I understand your intent on that, right, the reality is that most people don't want to be ignored for the unique identity characteristics and experiences that they bring to the table. So again, I think that, you know, the fundamental distinction, which seems so mundane between equity and equality, if we could actually get that and operate and practice and engage our processes around a modality of fairness, which means acknowledging differences and treating people potentially differently because of that, I think we can move the needle, or at least it opens up a very robust and I think important conversation. I think one of the things that I often speak about, and it sort of reminded me of the theme of this series that's going on here in the Alumni Education Organization. So not just solving the unsolvable, but discussing the undiscussables, right?
Right.
Where can we have conversations that may not be comfortable and may not be easy, but that are actually mission critical to advancing our work around DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, and you know, in our work, we really focus on equity, or I think of it also in terms of how do we make our structures and policies accessible to all people, you know, recognizing their differences. And so, like, if we think about the concept of universal design, for example, you know, if we have captioning on this Learning Institute, that's accessible for more people, including people that maybe need it because of a specific disability. So it really benefits all of us to create spaces that are more accessible. Something else you touched in on that, you know, I also wanted to talk a little bit about when we think about racial equity, and particularly anti-Black racism, and you talked about people wanting to be recognized for their identities and what they bring to the table. And I think this also kind of goes back to one of our challenges is to make sure we understand, we can articulate why we have this focus on racial equity. And the importance of that. And I think there are certainly drivers in both current drivers that are making this a priority, but also in our history and our position at Duke. I think we have an opportunity to be a leader because of our positioning in the South and kind of some of our history around race. And again, to this notion of creating accessibility, the better we are at breaking down barriers and structures that have excluded people based on race, we will also be able to dismantle barriers because of other marginalized identities. And so it's not that one thing takes priority over the other. I think that they all can benefit from the other. And when we were kind of thinking about our racial equity work, we really were thinking about all of our racial communities and what some of those particular challenges are when we were thinking about the structure, you know, who we were going to populate these subcommittees with. So I think we're getting some questions in the chat. So if we could probably shift to responding to some of those.
Sure. So we have a question. Judy, probably this is for you mostly. How is the School of Medicine defining the desired state of diversity and inclusion and belonging for the institution? And what is the institution doing to get there currently? If you could walk us through the plan sort of play by play, that would be awesome.
Okay, well, the play-by-play would take us a really long time, but Jen, if you wouldn't mind putting the link to the strategic plan actually in, I think I sent that to you right beforehand, and I really welcome and encourage all the participants to look at it specifically, because it's rock solid. I will just pat ourselves on the back. So many people contributed to this, but let me just talk a little bit about what the desired state is. So our strategic plan framework was built on 5 primary goals, and then we broke those goals down right further into strategic priorities. But let me just tell you the 5 goals. So first, we want to enhance racial diversity and equity, inclusion, and respect for all constituents. So across all of our constituents, we will enhance the diversity, equity, and inclusion. We want to advance careers, specifically amongst underrepresented racial and ethnic groups in medicine, biomedical science, and technology. That's number 2. The number 3rd is to catalyze our anti-racist practices through education of both our current and future workforce. And I just want to stop for a moment there and say the focus on this education is longitudinal. It is not a one and done, send people to training because we can count that and check a box. It's really about how do we nurture learning in a longitudinal way over the life cycle of an employee's career, a leader's development, a student's learning process, whether they're an MD student, a PA student, or a PT student. The 4th goal is to stimulate and promote evidence-based discoveries and their translation to reduce health disparities. Obviously, in School of Medicine, that's really important to us, right? So this is integral to our plan. How do we reduce health disparities? How do we promote equity and improve health for all? And then the last one is really about establishing the Duke School of Medicine as a transformative leader in anti-racism and social justice education and research. So those are our 5 those are big, juicy goals, right? There's a lot to go into that and to define, so what does that actually look like? Our priorities that were informed by the findings of our various constituents, from the voices of people, from focus groups, from our demographic data that was cut across all different modalities in terms of race and gender and ethnicity and positionality. They informed 5 other strategic priorities that fit into our goals. So we want to cultivate an inclusive, equitable, and anti-racist environment. So what does it feel like to be here? How can people actually thrive versus just survive, especially if you are not a member of a majority group? What is that sense of belonging, right? Where I feel that I matter, my voice is heard, I'm visible, I'm not invisible, and I'm not just trying to hang on for dear life. Medical school is hard enough. Working in medicine is hard enough. How do we facilitate the culture, right? Especially in the time of a global pandemic, to help people to actually be on purpose and on mission without anything being in the way that shouldn't be. Another key area is how do we nurture, reward, and attract outstanding talent? And we're very specific about saying nurture first. So for a long time, people have focused on how do we bring talent in, right? Well, we don't want to create a revolving door. We need to really be feeding, right? Especially the people who are part of our faculty, our staff, and our learners who are here, who represent diverse perspectives, backgrounds, and identities. How do we mentor and nurture them and reward them so that others who we want to reach out to see people here who are succeeding and can say, that's a place that I want to be. We have a great reputation. Instead of focusing purely on recruitment, bringing people, getting people in the door, but not really thinking about what happens once they are here. I talked about the advancing education. We also are focusing very much on anti-racist, equity-centered, and community-participated research practices, which are so important. So engaging with the Durham, Duke, and international community as well to make sure that we are inclusive in the way we practice our research and the way we practice medicine. And then the last piece that I'll just mention is really ensuring the only way that we're going to do all of this is by ensuring sustainability, by strengthening our leadership capacity and organizational accountability. So I think Kim mentioned earlier, the importance of engaging everyone in this work. This is not the work of just the vice president of diversity or the chief diversity officer for School of Medicine or the practitioners that work for Duke. It's really about how do we tool everyone in becoming an inclusive leader, whether or not you are a formal leader in your title or if you're a team member. What are the skills and the competencies, the practices and the processes of really navigating Duke from the space of inclusion?
All right, so Kim, I've got a question for you from Elizabeth. So you said that everything is not going to happen in 1 year, that it happens over several years. And Elizabeth mentions this article that came out in the Duke Chronicle. The link is in the chat for those that would like to look at it. Can we discuss the steps that need to be taken and can be taken by Big Duke in the response to groups like the Duke Native American Student Alliance? I'm thinking here of the NSA's recent open letter published last month in the Chronicle that touched on the need for establishment of Native studies programs, adopting a land acknowledgement, and the possibility of academic scholarships, among other actions. So thinking about all the groups.
No, that's a great question. And so we have students, we have 10 students who are part of this Racial Equity Advisory Council. And one of them, actually, we're meeting tomorrow to really think about this specific question, like how the students in particular can help us be responsive to student demands, including the demand letter from the Native American Student Association. So I think that's definitely something that we want to try to think about ways to address through our council. Specifically, the land acknowledgement, I think, is one aspect of it. It's something that our office had been working on over the last several months. So there's a group that includes some students from the Native American Students Association. There's a faculty member and some community members that were working together to think about creating some guidance at Duke for folks that want to do land acknowledgements. So that's a kind of an ongoing project that we've been working on in OIE, but that's just a kind of a floor level thing. I think we have a lot of opportunity to increase the numbers of students and faculty and just generally how we engage. So thinking about the American Indian community as part of how we address issues in the Racial Equity Advisory Council will definitely be part of that platform. So I think a lot of the items in the letter, I have to admit, are not inside specifically in my role, but where there are carve outs and just generally thinking about how we respond to that, I want to explore with students about how we can do that through this council. Someone asked another oh, sorry, go ahead, Jen.
So the next question, I'm going to sort of combine a couple of things, because this is really how people can make things actionable in their own lives. How can they take some of these things that these resources you're talking about, these sort of proactive steps to put those into their daily lives, whether that's communities they work with in their professional lives and their personal lives. What is it that they can do and navigate sometimes these tricky spaces where people are coming at something from opposite angles, or you don't even believe what that person is arguing for is actually a place that we should support. So I guess how people can take these and turn them into actions. Go ahead, Kim.
No, I think that's a really great question. And when we're doing workshops, we often try to challenge people to think about where can you have an impact from your own sphere of influence, right? So maybe you are, there's something you can do in your own work environment to just engage people on this topic. Maybe you are, if anyone who's involved in any kind of selection process or hiring, there is an opportunity to think about what does our community look like? How can we impact the demographics of whatever you're working on to be more inclusive? And then once you do that, are we bringing folks into an environment where they would feel supported? So I think if you really think about whatever your role is, I think there's always opportunities to do interpersonal learning. I think, we can never stop reading and engaging and learning more. And I think in your work sphere, for example, there's always some way I think you can find to impact diversity, equity, inclusion in the work that you're doing. There's almost nothing that doesn't have some thread that would connect to inclusion or creating a better environment for a more diverse community of people.
Anything to add there?
Yeah, sure. I'll just add on. I mean, Kim, I think, made great points already. One of the things I always think about, especially as I'm trying to navigate conversations across different sets of values, beliefs, and identities is how do we open up, right, dialogue versus shut it down? And so in some of the work that we're doing around education, which is very deep work, we're doing a 4-part mini series called Teaching and Leading Equity Now, which is really about honing strong racial equity practices in the day-to-day experience of being an employee, a learner, a person, a human being, a member of your family. And some of it is about a willingness to sit and listen and invite in the perspectives that are unique and different from your own. And can Judy truly sit in the presence of someone who doesn't value the same equity that I do? And with an open hand, not call them out, right? But invite them into a conversation with the goal of potentially being able to create some understanding that wasn't already there, right? So how do we expand the potential for some common ground? And for me, one of my practices that I always use, it sounds so simple, but it's often just asking a really well-positioned question, not from the perspective of gotcha, right? But from a curiosity. How do we cultivate curiosity? So Kim, I'm really curious about that. I see it differently than you. Can you tell me more about why fill in the blank, right? Or even just tell me more, right, is often a great way to just create, and the goal not necessarily being about consensus, right? But it is about deep, thoughtful, introspective listening. And I think that that's often, a mission critical first step in being able to influence change. I also think that seeing all of this work that we're talking about in the spectrum and context of change is critically important, because then when we experience resistance, right, we know that resistance is part of change. That's how it happens. If you don't have resistance, we're probably not up to something big enough.
Great. Well, I'm going to take that like as a quote and put that down on my things just to remember. If it's too easy, probably not doing a big enough project. One of the things that's come up even in our own conversations internally is when we think about the hiring practices at Duke and how we recruit new faculty and coming up with the right mix of voices and perspectives at the university, at large, and our healthcare providers and whatnot. Can you both sort of address how we're going about recruiting new voices at Duke and what's being sort of measured and weighed and evaluated in that process to sort of talk about the future of Duke and what it will look like?
Yeah, so that's a really important question. And really fresh in my mind. So last week, our office does a lot of workshops with faculty together with the Office of Faculty Advancement. And so we did a workshop last week on equitable hiring practices, and we have a similar kind of workshop for staff. But one of the really strong themes that came out of that was really trying to establish upfront what are your priorities, and making sure you have some consensus around what those priorities are. And you're not going to have everybody on the same table, but if you identify like these are the resource priorities, and we're embracing this notion that if we have a heterogeneous community, we're going to be better at solving problems. We're going to be more innovative, kind of tying it to these broader university objectives and mission around why we believe this is integral to our ability to be excellent. And then really having consistent practices. Those were strong themes that really came out. And the other thing was just in terms of recruiting, helping people to understand that there is a lot of flexibility in terms of how you recruit. So you can focus on particular communities if you know you're not diverse in a particular area, and really thinking about cultivating. Again, this is a long-term project as well. So you may want to start cultivating somebody when they're, a postdoc, or when you meet them at some conference, and over time developing a relationship with that person, and then when the opportunity is available, bringing them into the opportunity to, formally apply for a role at Duke. So, but that idea, I think a lot of the faculty members in this workshop were talking about the fact that they didn't necessarily have agreement about what their objectives were with the search at the beginning. And so then certain voices maybe have outsized influence. So if you kind of do that on the front end, I think that really helps to meet your goal. Now, it's challenging in certain areas, especially in certain disciplines. We know it's harder than others. And so it is, again, just about consistent practice and seeing your long-term goals in this area. But Duke has made incremental progress in the faculty space in terms of hiring people from underrepresented communities. So we're excited about that. We know we have a lot more to do in that space.
Great.
Yeah, we do a lot in School of Medicine and have been for quite some time, but I'd say we're amping it up now around ensuring that whenever we have a search process, similar to what Kim was speaking of, we engage the search committee in ensuring that they understand their own biases, the biases that they bring to the table. So I will go in and do, at the very first launch, the search committee, I will do a 1-hour session, usually not enough time, but it's better than nothing, to really put the conversation about the human condition of bias, right? The truth is we all have them. It is part of the way our brains function, right? We get way too much information on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis to be able to not put things in boxes. So the thing that we are really trying to do is reframe the narrative around bias as something that's part of aberrant behavior or ignorance, and instead humanize it, recognize it, be willing to look at my own, and then how does my bias, right, once I learn about it, how may it be impacting not just the way I think, but also the way I act, the way I select? What are the things that I am drawn to? So when I'm interviewing a candidate or looking at CVs or having a conversation and I discover something that is simpatico, right? Oh, you went to the same college or university that I did, right? That then becomes a currency for warmth and likability, and it impacts my scoring and those sorts of things. So we're really trying to introduce practices and processes that help people navigate the human condition of bias and also look at patterns, right? So how do the patterns of all these individuals cumulatively and collectively impact hiring of groups that are historically disadvantaged or marginalized in the world of work or the world of healthcare, right? So we're doing a lot of work, and I will tell you that a lot of people come into the session that's usually titled something like Navigating Bias in the Search Committee, a little bit concerned and, maybe have their guards up, but by the end, undoubtedly, people are speaking about the fact that there are things that they discovered that are so helpful, not just for the search committee process, but even for the ways that they navigate relationships at home or with their teams. So I think it's a critical area for us to continue to have diligence on. And the other thing that I'll just say is, I think when people ask questions about recruitment and search committee and are we in fact biased in our recruitment, my answer would be yes, because we're human. Yes, we are, we all are, but is there a willingness again to introspect and examine it and then say, what can we do differently if it's not aligned with who we say we want to be, if it's not aligned with, as an institution, what we say our goals are. And the last thing I'll say about that is I think representation matters, but representation is one piece, right? So we need to look at, and I say in my job, I often navigate the world when I go into conference rooms pre-COVID, when I go into conference rooms or I go into classrooms or I go into boardrooms, I feel like part of my obligation is to notice who's there and who's not, and then ask myself some questions like, why might that be? As opposed to necessarily assuming right off the bat, but why might that be? So that's really about cultivating that curiosity.
Fantastic. I've seen a lot of questions that actually some of those resources that we posted in the chat a little earlier may address. So I encourage you to definitely check out the OIE site and the site that Judy shared just a few moments ago. The other thing I'm going to share is that we do have a session tonight at 7 p.m. on civil discourse. So if this is an area where you're trying to figure out how do you bring people with differing opinions together, and that's a topic you're interested in, that session will be at 7 p.m. tonight, and I will put my email address in the chat, and you can just email me there, and I will send you that information so that you can join. So before we conclude, I do want to thank Judy and Kimberly for their time this afternoon and sharing some really thoughtful comments on how we can all think about our work differently, how we can all be a bit more inclusive and just come to the table with some grace and openness and willingness to make change where obviously a lot of change is still needed. Thank you all for joining the conversation this afternoon. We will be sending out an email with links to those books that both of them mentioned today and space for you to click on links and be able to visit some of the other sites and resources that are available by Duke. We do have a session coming up on October 5th that is in this track as well. So the next thing we're looking at is climate change, which is another one of those big sticky problems that no one has a single answer for. So please sign up for that if you are able to join us. And I hope everybody has a great afternoon. And again, thank you to Kimberly and Judy for giving their time this afternoon. Take care, everybody.